Hi there, I'm Hannah, and in this video I'm going to show you how to play a game called Candy, Sink, or Float. For Candy, Sink, or Float, very importantly, you will need candy, and an assortment of candy is best. So you might have some candies that are made with chocolate, some that have caramel, some that have a wafer center. Any kind of assorted candies will work for this experiment. You'll also need a bowl that has water in it, just like this. And you'll want a piece of paper and a pencil or pen. All right, to begin our Candy, Sink, or Float experiment, we're first going to predict whether or not we think each of our assorted candies will sink or float when it is dropped into a bowl of water. To make your predictions, you should write down the names of all the candies that you plan to test, and then I would recommend removing the candies from their wrappers so that you're able to get a better look at them. So for example, this Butterfinger, it feels pretty heavy in my hand, and it looks to be filled with something that is not chocolate. So I'm going to use those observations to help predict that I think this Butterfinger will sink when I put it into a bowl of water. And do that same thing for all of the candies that you plan to test. All right, once you have made all of your sink or float candy predictions, it's time to test. So one by one, gently place your unwrapped pieces of candy into a bowl of water and see if they stay on top of the water or if they sink down to the bottom. I would recommend grabbing some paper towels for this part, just because things can get a little messy. So let's first test Butterfinger. It sank, and I predicted sink, so I was correct. I'm going to give myself a check. I'm going to pull it out of the water and place it onto this paper towel. All right, next up we have a Reese's. This one was hard for me to decide because I know that Reese's are filled with a light whipped peanut butter filling, but it felt really heavy to me, so I predicted sink. Let's see what happens. Ooh, it did sink. I was right. It almost floated though. It didn't sink quite as quickly as the Butterfinger candy. All right, let's test a Three Musketeers now. For Three Musketeers, I predicted float because it felt lighter in my hands. And it is floating, very cool. All right, next up we have an Almond Joy, which I know is filled with one almond and coconut. So I predicted, because I know that coconut on its own floats, I predicted that an Almond Joy would float. Let's see. It does not. That sank pretty fast, actually. Interesting. So my prediction was not right there. We have two more candies to test. First up, a plain Hershey's chocolate bar. I predicted, because it felt pretty light, and I think that this chocolate isn't super solid inside, even though it is made of pure chocolate, I predicted float, but I don't know if I'm gonna be right. It sank. It sank pretty slowly, but it still sank. And our final candy to test, this one felt super duper light in my hand, so I am pretty positive that it's gonna float. But let's test it out and see. The Kit Kat, it floats. Awesome. All right, so now that we've tested whether or not these candies sink or float, let's learn some of the STEM behind why candies sink or float in the first place. So when you place a piece of candy or any object into water, there are two forces acting on it. First of all, there's the force of gravity, and that pulls the object down and makes it possibly sink. The second force acting on it is called the buoyant force, and that is the force that pushes up on the object and tries to get it to float. Now, the force of gravity is equal to the weight of the object. The buoyant force is equal to the weight of the water that the object displaces. So When I put a Butterfinger into a bowl of water, it displaces an amount of water equal to the size of the Butterfinger. And that water weighs a certain amount. That is the buoyant force pushing up on the Butterfinger. However, gravity is also acting on the Butterfinger, and that is equal to the weight of the candy itself. And in the case of our Butterfinger, the weight of the candy is greater than the weight of the water that it displaces. However, in the case of Three Musketeers or Kit Kat candies, the amount of water that they displace weighs more than the candy itself does. So whenever the buoyant force is greater than the force of gravity, an object will float. And whenever the buoyant force is less than the force of gravity, the object will sink. So I hope you learned something new in this video, and I hope you take the time to play a fun game of Candy, Sink, or Float.